Okay, everybody. Hello. We're going to make a start now. This is the first of the debates in the Battle for Social Policy strand. This is the Courtyard Gallery, and all the debates will be taking place in the strand in this room. I suppose it takes its beginnings with the Social Policy Forum and the Parents Forum and the debates that we've been having over the past year or two. And we're presenting it in association with Strand Partners, Royal College of Art and the Helen Hamlin Centre, and with debate partners and associates Times Higher, the Economic and Social Research Council, Brook and the Wellcome Trust. So I'll just run through the debates and what they are. So we're starting here with what's the point of the social sciences, and then we move on to is the big society the good society? Too much, too young, why is policy obsessed with teenage moms? Early intervention, saving children from their future, question mark. And then finally, doting dads. So Claire Fox asked me to introduce the strands, and I asked her what she wanted me to say. I wasn't entirely sure. And the first thing she said was, don't get bogged down in policy, which was slightly problematic as it's a social policy strand. So, but I think I know what she meant. She wanted us to have a wider discussion, not to be a technical policy wonk type discussion, though I'm sure there'll be a few social policy wonks here. We're going to encourage people to have a broader public debate. I think also it's probably worth mentioning that we could quite easily get bogged down in a discussion about the comprehensive spending review, which wouldn't be a good idea. We shouldn't ignore it, because obviously that's in the background and will influence a lot of the discussions, but I don't think we should use that as the framework for every discussion we have. In January 2009, we set up the Social Policy Forum with the challenge to have a look at and explore what we called social policy by stealth. Our quote, we said, instead of policymakers trying to find ways to better meet people's needs, they are more likely to be found promoting behavioural change or advocating intrusive interventions into people's lives. I think this is a theme that may well run through some of today's debates. Not by design, but this is something which seems to be a common theme just looking through the programme. Now, obviously, we have a new government, so one of the questions might be, is it a new government but the same old ideas? For instance, is the big society a new big idea, or do politicians and policymakers have no idea? Nobody seems to know what the big society is, for instance. Is it about people's everyday freedoms to get on with things unencumbered by the big state? Or is it a continuation of the New Labour project of rebuilding communities and reforming public services? Early intervention, that will be another discussion we'll be having later on. Sure Start, New Labour's flagship social policy initiative, has survived the cuts. Early intervention, alongside the big society, seems to become the new policy orthodoxy. So that in itself should be cause for concern, and it's something we should perhaps interrogate. If our destinies are shaped in the early years and regarded as legitimate objects of policy interventions, do we become, or how do we become, responsible adults? And finally, the family is going to be a major part of today's discussions. I think it's the family where experts seem to congregate the most, and where evidence, however dubious, is most often cited, and often with an intervention in mind. Teenage mothers, despite what a recent politician had to say about it, they don't make up 54% of under-18s in the most deprived areas. The real figure is 5.4%. I think this should lead us to question the presentation of prejudice as fact. But perhaps more importantly, it should also prompt us to ask, why should we intervene in the lives of young women who are mostly adults in the first place? Coming to doting dads, is encouraging young men to be good dads a good thing? Or are policymakers infantilizing them too, by assuming responsibility for them and turning families into instruments of social policy to boost educational performance or tackle crime? So, in reverse order, from doting dads and early intervention to teenage moms and the big society, I'll now hand over to Tiffany to talk about what's the point of the social sciences.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Come and sit down and make yourselves comfortable. My name's Tiffany Jenkins. I'm a sociologist. I sound like I should be at an AA meeting. I hope you all are too, or have some interest in the social sciences, because that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. I'm the chair of the session, and the way this session will work is that my 4 panellists will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes, so quite brief. They'll introduce their thoughts on the role of the social sciences today. It's not just in the context of the CSR, as has been said already, and we want to look really at the role the social sciences can play and are asked to play more generally today in having an impact upon society and producing evidence for social policy. And we want to ask, to what extent are these demands realistic and appropriate? And what do we see the role of the social sciences today? They'll each speak for about 5 minutes, as I said. We'll then have a conversation between ourselves quite briefly and then go out to you for your points and contributions. You don't just have to have questions. We're interested also in what you think. This is a conversation between ourselves. So I'll introduce the panel and then we'll get started. First to speak on my far left is Peter Taylor-Gooby. Peter is co-director of the ESRC Families and Social Capital Research Group. Actually,
no, that's me.
That's completely bizarre, yes. Sorry, a little cut and paste error there. But it's good to see my panel are thinking and alert. I was just checking. None of you noticed, so wake up. So, Peter, let me just check. Peter is Professor of Social Policy at the University of Kent at Canterbury. He's the Director of the ESRC RISK Programme, and he's the author of Reframing Social Citizenship. Val, immediately on my right, Val is co-director of the Families and Social Research Capital Research Group at London South Bank University, and she's the author of Marginalised Mothers, exploring working class experiences of parenting. After Val, we'll hear from Jude, England, who's on my far right. Jude is Head of Social Sciences at the British Library, and she's the co-author of the Sage Handbook of Digital Dissertations and Theses. And then after Jude, we'll hear from Dr. Ellie Lee, who's on my left. Ellie is senior lecturer in social policy at the University of Kent, Canterbury, and she's the coordinator of the Pro-Choice Forum. She's also director of the newly opened Centre for Parenting Studies there. So quite a lot of parenting experts on the panel, but it won't just be about how to bring up your children. Peter, if I could start with you, if at all. Yes, if you'd like to give us your 5 minutes, we'll begin.
Right. Well, thanks very much for inviting me, giving me the opportunity to talk here. I always feel a gorgeous sense of irresponsibility when I come along to these kinds of occasions, because I feel I could say anything I like, and people probably listen to it for a couple of minutes. Whereas normally I speak to other academics, and I have to present a research question, a hypothesis, I have to test it with evidence, and then they argue among themselves endlessly about the details of the evidence, and I never quite know what the point of the exercise was. So let me just make my 2 irresponsible points to kick things off. First, I have a feeling that somehow we've got the wrong social scientists here. I think we've got people here who are keen on communicating as broadly as possible, keen on having an impact, keen on influencing policy. Spend a lot of effort in trying to do that. Now, my impression is that in the world of policy making, social science certainly plays a role. And social scientists have got a great deal to say about the big issues of our time. I won't, of course, mention the wars, but if we think about the future trajectory of the British economy, the current shift to a growth model that involves substantially more inequality, substantially more poverty at the bottom and wealth at the top, and those kinds of issues, if we talk about policy shifts like the privatisation of pretty well all of local government services, much of the NHS, much of the education system, and so if we think about how we manage migration, what kind of multiculturalism we want to see developing, all these big issues, certainly they're discussed by social policy people and social scientists, but I'm not convinced that social scientists actually have a huge influence on what happens in policy terms. Having said that, that's probably entirely healthy, but it does mean that if we're going to think about those issues and the role of social science in relation to them, we should perhaps move beyond the social scientists. We should start thinking about how public debates and policy debates happen in our society. That means we have to think about education. we have to think about the media, and dare I say it, we have to think about how our democracy functions and the shortcomings of our democratic system. So I'm not sure that just having a panel of social scientists to talk about how social science relates to policy is really the best way to go about it. We're just one little cog in this vast machine that produces policy, and we're probably one of the less important cogs. The other point I'd like to make, and again, that's great, really sort of criticise the whole framing of the debate and stuff. People do this, but they haven't got anything substantive to say. Thinking about the kinds of social scientists we've got here. We're all sociologists or social policy people. We come from the soft, nice, sensitive end of social science. Sure we do. And we're people who are, I think, aware of the complexity of social life, of the role of culture and values, of how the way in which different groups in society behave and relate to each other is inserted in the whole complex of social interactions and communications. We're not people who tend to adopt simple individualist accounts of behaviour. We're not people who emphasise incentives as the royal road to understanding how to influence people. But on the odd occasions I've attempted to influence policymakers, if I'm doing really well, I get as far as going to the Cabinet Office or to the Treasury, and there I meet groups of very, very bright people who have rather different models of how society works and how people behave. And these, of course, are the people who, under previous governments, have led the shift towards marketisation and internal markets in the healthcare, education, social services. These are the people who emphasise the role of incentives and think that the way forward in the labour market is not so much to support people into work, provide training, childcare and so on, but it's to improve incentives by reducing living standards at the bottom below the lowest possible wages. And these are the people who understand public policy very much in terms of cost efficiency. Can I mention one fact? This is not as widely known as it should be, but if you look at the, you can find this through the ONS, National Statistics, official government website, just by searching through it. If you look at cost efficiency, productivity in public services, you might think, well, that's a pretty prominent theme these days. We don't have much money. We've got to make the thing deliver the goods cheaply as we possibly can. An enormous range of reforms in the last 20 or 30 years designed to improve cost efficiency in public services. All the things from introducing incentives, decentralising budgets down to managers who compete with each other, the whole new public management revolution, all the introduction of new forms of information technology and communication, use of private companies like Serco, or in the health services, Grand Metropolitan Hotels and so on, to deliver services at the front line, and many other reforms, all directed at cost efficiency. Government spends a lot of energy trying to work out what the impact is. Impact, that's a good word, isn't it? Well, the impact is actually, if you look over the last 25 years, it's been done for healthcare and for education, almost exactly zero. There have been no serious gains in cost efficiency in the major public services in the UK for the last 25 years. Official fact, and you can find it in the government statisticians on the ONS website. Well, that's not quite true. There was a short period in education in the early 2000s when, because the numbers of kids coming into school increased quite sharply in a couple of years, and the money didn't increase, you did get more cost efficiency because you didn't actually have much more money relative to the number of kids coming in. But when the population of school kids stabilised, you went back where you were. So that's not necessarily relevant. Now, we've had enormous impact, and it's been led really by Treasury thinking and by particular social sciences, mainly by economics and applied economics and econometrics, to some extent making more inroads now various bits of psychology, which provide models of how people behave based on incentives and the assumptions that people operate as individuals, not as elements in a very complex social interaction. Cost efficiency has been one of their great goals. They have failed to achieve it. You don't see this discussed in public debate. So my points are, we should have economists and psychologists here, but we should also have a much broader range of people. We should not only have sociologists and social policy people and social scientists, but we should have people concerned with education, with the media, with public policy more generally, if we want to think about how our little, rather internal and self-regarding world fits into the big machine. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, focusing on the central question here then, what's the point of the social sciences? And I actually think there are two ways of answering it. And the first is to look at how social sciences are being used at the moment, and in fact some would say abused in contemporary politics. And the second is to draw out what they actually do have to offer. And I do think it's important to differentiate between the two because they've become quite conflated in recent years. So current attempts to justify social science as a public expenditure largely seem to be focused on their impact on social policy and practice. And these arguments are built on top of a more general enthusiasm for evidence-based policy as an attempt to try and ground decisions in objective fact. So from this perspective then, social science should exist not just to inform policymakers, but to directly translate into action. So you can see how this provides a clear account of social science as this valuable commodity producing applied evidence. And in fact, the logical conclusion of this model is that decisions could be pretty much removed from the political realm altogether. Because if all that matters is what works, then scientists, in theory, can become the objective arbiters, determining policy directions and initiatives through robust and rigorous testing. But I'm going to argue that this philosophy is flawed and it's dangerous for a number of reasons. Not least because policymaking is, and it always will be, an inherently ideological practice. It's founded on notions of what a good society looks like and of the related particular understandings of justice, fairness and morality. So while social science is crucial in helping to shape politically informed decisions, these decisions are necessarily contextualised by already existing political values and ideology. But this does seem to be something that politicians are increasingly reluctant to acknowledge. And more often, scientific evidence is presented in an attempt to try and transcend politics and to foreclose debate. So, for example, instead of arguing that certain family practices are more morally desirable, it's often claimed that they produce better outcomes for children. So the first claim is contestable. The second claim gets asserted as research fact, although still highly contested, because the use of social science in policy-making circles is highly strategic. Governments pick and choose their research evidence very carefully. And as many academics will bear testament to, if findings don't fit the direction being pursued, then they'll be ignored, misinterpreted, actively suppressed, or rubbished on methodological grounds, and policymakers then trawl for more sympathetic accounts. So it's against this backdrop that social science is being held to account in terms of public expenditure. And the largest funding body, the ESRC, is currently trying to justify its existence from within this evidence-based framework. So research funding is now explicitly tied to an evaluation of potential impact on policy and practice, with impact referring to a demonstrable effect or change. So in short, unless you can convince the ESRC that your research will be taken up and put to practical use, you won't receive funding in the first place. And if you are lucky enough to get the funding, then at the end of the project you have to provide evidence of the impact that you have actually made. Now inevitably this is going to narrow the kinds of social research conducted. I think more seriously it works to discourage analyses that cut across dominant paradigms. Studies which are politically challenging or uncomfortable for governments have precious little way of demonstrating impact. So researchers are forced to become risk adverse to survive. And the other danger is to the basic independence of social science. ESRC-funded researchers are now very personally invested in seeing their findings affect some change. And given that careers will depend on it, there has to be some temptation to actively lobby for this, or to tone down, reframe or omit material that might cause offence. Or worse still, to design research projects that are likely to produce appealing findings for governments. I think the real point of social sciences shouldn't really need spelling out in that way. They're part of the long-standing tradition of intellectual thought that our civilization has been built on, and we would be a mindless and a directionless society without them. And at a more basic level, you simply can't govern, legislate and provide for populations without knowing something about them. Needs have to be evaluated, social problems identified and tackled, and there has to be some way of knowing how effective or not policy measures actually are. So this involves engaging meaningfully with the sheer convoluted complexity of the social world in a careful, meticulous and informed way. Up until now, a key role of social science has been to challenge oversimplistic assumptions through critically informed insights. But the momentum really does seem to be pushing in the opposite direction now, under this guise of maximising impact. So the likely result is that we're increasingly encouraged to look for simple problems that we can find simple answers to. And this has serious consequences, and clearly not just for social scientists. I think we'll be intellectually and functionally poorer for it. To properly get to grips with a constantly shifting social world and to make a genuine positive difference, researchers need to be able to set new agendas and to take risks. And this means, perhaps to state the obvious, that we can't fix the parameters and predict what our policy outcome will be before we've begun the research. So to finish up then, conducting academic research and making policy obviously are linked, but they are and they should remain separate activities. There are plenty of think tanks out there to do the kind of ideologically bound work that's designed to have policy impact. But without independent thought and deep critical analysis, there can be no such thing as social science in the first place, let alone any point to it. Thank you, Graham. Jude.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I think one of the joys about this type of debate is that there's different tacks the speakers will take to answering the question. But I think there are going to be some common themes emerging. And when I was thinking about what to say this morning, it struck me that there are two questions. Actually, what is social science? And what would the world be without it? Now, the Economic and Social Research Council defines social science as the study of society and the manner in which people behave and impact upon the world. It also points out that it encompasses a broad church of disciplines, from sociology to law to social legal studies, management and business studies, economics, anthropology, human geography. I could go on. They all use different methodologies and perspectives, but they all fundamentally looking at questions of how many, who, why, and in what way. Now, some of those disciplines probably wouldn't agree that they'd sit within that broad church, but they do sit in my department in the British Library, as does sociolinguistics, and some of you may have seen the vast amount of press and TV coverage on Thursday on the project to get people to read a paragraph from the Mr. Men books, to collect examples of how we talk and the type of language. So examples were mischievous or mischievous, H or H. But what that simple exercise will do is tell us a lot about class, about migration, about perceptions, and about how the way we talk has an impact on the way our lives will end up. There are lots and lots and lots of sociology that talks about that. So preparing this talk got me thinking a little bit about me and why I'm a social scientist, and I thought perhaps my own journey might throw a little bit of a light on why it matters. I'm one of the final ones who passed the 11 plus before there was comprehensive education, and the school I was at went comprehensive about a year after I got there in 1966. And that radical change was the result of research which looked at how the selective system that was in operation replicated class discrimination. And there's a whole debate that we can have about the success or otherwise of the comprehensive system. And I think it's right that that debate's informed by evidence, not by assumption and prejudice. Now, going back to me, faced with the choice of physics at O-level or CSE, those of you who remember, there used to be a two-tier system of exams at 16, or CSE social studies, I opted for the latter. Now that was radical. I was a grammar school girl. I was doing something that was the preserve of the kids who were the ex-secondary modern kids. And therein lies another little tale about why social science is important. But we argued we should get the chance to do O-level, so I've got a GCSE, CSE grade 1 and an O-level in sociology. And we were the first to do A-level at school. And one of the transformative experiences I remember having is learning about roles and spending a class arguing about whether male and female behaviours were the result of nature or nurture. Now, even that debate has moved on now as science has changed, but I can remember saying they were fixed. I would never say that now, but, although actually I might now say they were fixed for all sorts of other reasons. But anyway. But I've also spent the greater part of my career working in social research, lots of that for government, looking at impact, and I have lots of ideas about whether I think that's had any impact or not. But what's interesting is that I'm now seeing policy suggestions which should be informed by research that we carried out 20 or 30 years ago. There is so much research that could be used on the impact of moving for work, the impact of housing benefit changes. It's there is evidence there. So my first question might be to echo a phrase from the Pythons, what did social science ever do for me? Well, it opened my eyes to ways of looking at and understanding the world, the importance of evidence. It provides a framework for critical and contextual thinking, a way of reading and making sense of information about intended and unexpected consequences. And I think this critical eye is increasingly important in this age we live in with rolling insatiable media. Appetite for blowing up issues, and I'm sure this will come out through today and the weekend. You know, 70% do X, Y, and Z, shock, horror. But context is all. One of the founding fathers of sociology, Durkheim, is mentioned. Now, Durkheim, fantastic social facts, used statistics, looked at statistics, analysed them. His classic study of suicide, where he says that suicide was less common in religious societies, Catholic societies, because of the social norms and behaviours. But actually, it's also less common because they didn't collect the statistics that way, because it was unacceptable, socially unacceptable, to say that people had committed suicide, because they wouldn't be buried in the relevant churchyard. So actually, his statistics, to start with, I thought, so you have to understand the nature of the social context. We've been running, I thought another example would be contemporary concern about the collapse of the family, and obviously the panel, we've got lots of information, but social policies being used to mitigate against the collapse of the family, tax breaks and so on. And it also can centre around food, which is itself emotionally laden, and the role of mothers. And we had an event in the library, we've been running a series called Myths and Realities, where we take social issues and we challenge assumptions, and this one was called Are We What We Eat? One of our speakers was Professor Anne Murcott, who looked at the myth of the family meal. And at the moment there's loads of popular debate about predicting the death of the family because we don't sit around the dinner table together, with headlines such as families drift apart if they don't eat together. But Anne's point was, what's the evidence and is it a new phenomenon? And she found, used a report from as long ago as 1929, and I quote, and this was from sociologists, mealtime as family reunion time was taken for granted a generation ago. There is arising a conscious effort to save meal times at least for the family. As one mother expressed it, even if we only have a little time at home together, we want to make the most of that little. In our family, we always try to have Sunday breakfast and dinner together at least. And if you think about that generation referred to in that quote is at the end of the 19th century. Paul Thompson collected 400 life histories from people born at the end of the 19th and 20th century, so they were sort of Edwardians. And at that point, family meal times and domestic routines were dependent on practices taking place outside the home. So they had, again, this family meal as a venerated sort of middle-class goal. But when they did take place, they took place either weekdays at midday or on Sundays, and they were dictated by the demands of paid employment outside the home. And then she quoted some time use data, 1966, 1999, 2004, and actually that found that compared to the 1960s, the majority of eating time was spent with at least one other member of your household present. So actually that conclusion of the link, you can't necessarily conclude that there's a link between food, sociability, family, that actually now has been irredeemably broken, because it might not have been there in the first place. So taking that critical view of this current discourse provides a much greater understanding of what's going on. And perhaps the debate says much more about the way eating together is valued. And what we do is that we have the debate to reinforce our values and to reinforce what we want to do. Although we can also interpret the debate less positively about a mode of social control, that what we're attempting to do is control mothers, their behaviours, what's expected of them. But either way, using social science to unpick and provide evidence is really important. So, to conclude, social science for me provides this tool to question, to understand, to critique, to unpick society. And within policy making, it should be used to scope, understand and interpret and evaluate policies and issues. It can answer how many and who, but it also brings to focus the context, the how, when, what, why, and what's going on around. It is unstable. There won't be right answers necessarily. And I think the point that Val made is one that I also want to make, that policy formulation is driven by ideology. And at least if it is driven by ideology, at least it should be done so with an understanding of the complexity of the issues and the potential consequences of a course of action. And that at the moment is what seems to be missing within the debate. So without that social science, we become less critical and less knowing, and we know less about the world we inhabit. Thanks.
Thank you, Jude. Ellie.
Thanks, and everybody else, thanks for the opportunity to talk on this panel. I agree with a lot of the points that have been made. Social science is a broad church, there's lots of disciplines. As far as I can tell, the ones that are the most influential at the moment, and there's particular reasons for this that we can discuss, are certain brands of economics and also behavioural psychology. So a type of social science which apparently puts forward arguments about how you get people to modify their behaviour, think about the way they behave differently. And I think there's reasons for those brands of social science becoming more influential ones. And I agree with a lot of the points that Val has made about the problems of the politicisation of social science and the way it's going on at the moment. When I was thinking about this talk this morning and this session, and answering the question, what is the point of the social sciences, my mind sort of drifted to thinking about my own career as a social scientist and why I ever became one. So I suppose kind of what is the point of me type question, and that led me to think about an American sociologist, which people may or not read her work, somebody called Kristin Luker, who's been phenomenally influential in my own career. Her research career spanned time from the early 70s up to now, and she's produced what in my mind are a series of absolutely brilliant books which have tackled a range of questions, including why do women get pregnant and not use contraception when they don't want to be pregnant, why do teenagers have babies and why do we worry about it so much as a society, why are so many American women involved in political movements around abortion, and these have been questions in my own research career that I've been very interested in. Luker inspired me, and I think probably many people who work in social sciences became social scientists because they'd read things which had inspired them, that had really made them think again, had upturned all their presumptions about things, had designed beautiful studies which use all sorts of different methodologies and ways of thinking about problems, and they just open your mind. And for me, that's really the entry point into social science and thinking about what the social sciences are for, is to think about a type of scholarship which has the capacity to upturn existing presumptions, to ask us to think in a different way about pre-given concepts, to not use those concepts, to not use pre-given ideas and ways of thinking about things, to refute the idea that we should simply go with existing models while we're trying to understand why things are the way they are, to really have an independence of thought, an independence of methodology, a broadness of mind. I think this would hold really for all sorts of academic disciplines. It would also hold for history, it would hold for philosophy, it would hold for anything really which can constitute a type of academic work and a type of approach which is one which I think is worthy of the name scholarship. So my answer to the question, what is the social sciences for, would be to say it's there to do something really scholarly. And what is scholarly is to do those things that I've described, to try and upturn presumptions, and to read a book where you get to the end of it and you think, that really has made me think. That's made me think about everything that I've ever thought before. It's made me think about new ways of doing research. And for my own part, Kristin Luker is somebody who made me want to teach, because I wanted to find ways of talking to other people about those types of ideas, talking to students about how to do social science work, and talking to anybody really about these ways of thinking about things. I then started thinking about Kristin Luker and her work in relation to the current context of university life and what it's like. And I started thinking, if Kristin Luker was trying to write an application to a funding council, how would she have got on? And I have to say, I mean, it might have been that she would have ended up getting some money for her studies, but I probably doubt it, for precisely the reasons that Val explained, that the questions that she asked, the way she formulated her studies, didn't simply go with pre-existing ways of thinking about things. They didn't copy ideas and problems which policymakers have in their minds already. They were really independent of those things. They came out of her own thinking, her discussion with other colleagues, I presume, and she really had a kind of approach to these things which was her own. Now, the irony of somebody like Kristin Luker is that I would argue that what she's come up with through her research career, the answers she's provided to policy problems, because these are all things that she's written about, are all things that policymakers are very preoccupied with, they're much, much better answers than pretty much everything else that's ever been written, which is why I like her so much. Come up with some brilliant explanations for these things. The thing about it is, though, is that those explanations aren't ones which you could have come up with a priori through simply copying and going along with the pre-given agenda and trying to go from that starting point. It was only possible for those answers to be formulated and that work to be done from this starting point of independence, really, and her own thoughts and her own ideas. So from that point of view, I very strongly agree with some of the points that Val made, is that the first problem with the way things are at the moment, with the politicisation of social science which is currently occurring, is I think ironically it ends up with a situation where a lot of the time the social science that we are producing and will be producing is actually less valuable, less useful, and potentially will have less impact in terms of understanding the world and what we do about it than were those things not in place. And my own view is that a lot of the work that's being done in this climate of a demand for relevance and a demand for impact, in precisely the way Val explains, is becoming increasingly narrow, because it's forced to take on board existing preoccupations, existing perceptions of problems, and simply provide direct, unilateral, one-size-fits-all type answers to those questions. And I think as a result it's just worse social science. This brings me to my second point, which I think is an aspect of this problem of the politicisation of social science, which is less widely discussed, which is what happens when this type of work enters the policy domain. And also related to that question, why are policymakers so interested in it anyway? I mean, why are they so concerned to take on the mantle of social science and take on the mantle of evidence to explain what it is that they're doing? Now, if you look at what happens in practice, my argument would be, and my colleague from Kent, Mary Evans, has made this point very nicely in articles she's written for the Times Higher, is if you look at what happens in practice, I actually think it's arguable that oftentimes some of the less insightful social science, some of the social science with simple answers to questions, which aren't complex, which haven't looked at problems in totality, they're the ones that get picked up on, and they're the ones that have traction because they appear to provide easy answers to social problems, which are the type of answers that policymakers appear to want. I know there's a whole panel on this later, but if you take the example of teenage pregnancy and what's happened around that, there's actually a mass of really, really brilliant studies. There's some really, really brilliant books about this subject, not just Kristin Luker's, but there's a British scholar, Lisa Arai, who's written a fantastic book on the subject. There's a raft of articles in scholarly journals about this issue. None of this has had any traction. So in other words, there's a massive evidence about teenage pregnancy, but because it doesn't say what policymakers want to hear, it's had no impact and it's considered irrelevant, and it's actually simply ignored as far as I can see. What has had impact is a certain type of answer to the question, what do we do about teenage pregnancy, which from my perspective is the least insightful. It basically seems to say, well, if you want to do something about it, then you need to have a sex education system like Holland, and that'll kind of solve the problem, which seems to me to be a very inadequate answer to the question. So I think that's one point about it, is that what gets picked up in the policy arena is oftentimes a type of social science which is the least insightful, and other very good work gets completely ignored. The second thing which increasingly strikes me, and I have to say terrifies me, worries me, places me in a situation at work which is oftentimes also schizophrenic, where I move from this kind of experience of pleasure and excitement when I read something like Kristen Luca to a feeling of complete doom and gloom when I read policy documents and I read what they say about social science. Because when you read policy documents and what's getting picked up on and what's passing in the name of social science in those documents, it really is shockingly terrible. I mean, it's absolutely awful when you look at a lot of the things that policymakers are saying when they cover themselves in this garb of the social science says to justify what they're doing. I'm just going to read out one example of this. This comes from a document called Early Intervention, Good Parents, Great Kids, Better Citizens. It's a document, well yes, the title says it all and it's relevant to this discussion. But the thing about this document, it's published by the Centre for Social Justice and authored by Ian Duncan-Smith and Graham Allen. And this is the basis for a very large programme of social policy intervention which is now being designed around the concept of early intervention. So the new government has a thing called the Early Intervention Commission, and this commission is going to go forward with a whole range of interventions, no doubt, in the sphere of early intervention. And this document is the starting point for it. So here's what it says. This is Ian Duncan-Smith's introduction. As the fabric of society crumbles at the bottom, what is left behind is an underclass, where life is characterised by dependency, addiction, debt and family breakdown. What exercises me perhaps more than anything else is the very scale of these problems, the creeping expansion of this underclass. The norm is dysfunctional. The dysfunctional norm is spreading. This is why Rhys Jones was gunned down whilst walking across Croxteth on the way home from football practice. This is why we're seeing his fate of fatal knifings and murderous beatings. So Ian Duncan-Smith has this concept of the dysfunctional base which is spreading. What he then says, and you can make what you like of that claim, his argument is the evidence from social science tells us that this is true. And he says the evidence that people in the dysfunctional base have their children earlier and faster than average, building up a massive social and financial problem unless it is addressed soon. So his argument is that apparently the evidence tells us that we have this massive dysfunctional people who are almost sort of breeding their way into becoming an even bigger mass, and we should just believe this because the evidence tells us it's true. What he then says, and this is the quote that really gets me, there remain the problems of what social scientists call the existing stock, the children and young people who are already presenting with severe difficulties, as well as the flow, those who are at risk and yet to be born. So apparently social science has not only proved evidence of an expanding dysfunctional base, it has also categorised that dysfunctional base into two components, the stock and the flow. The stock are the ones that are born already, the flow are the ones that are yet to be born, and what early intervention has to do is to target this dysfunctional base to address the problems of the stock and the flow. Now, I don't know who these social scientists are, I really don't. I have never read any social science which has used the concept stock and flow. Maybe it's out there, presumably it is, somewhere. But my point is that how has this come to be the social science which is in the policy document? How has this come to be here? And what do we do about this? I mean, I find it so objectionable that basically my profession is now being discussed and used in this type of way, that policymakers can give us this kind of account of the social world. I'm very concerned that there's not enough reaction to it from my profession and that we don't try and do more about this and have something to say on it. I'm also very interested in discussing, which I think is the other problem with this, is what on earth is going on in political life? You know, why is it that politics has become about this type of thing, where politicians, when they want to describe what they want to do, feel like they've got to make reference to third-rate social science to make the case for their policies. So, in conclusion, my argument would be is that there's very significant problems in relation to what's going on at the moment in regard to social science, what our profession is about, what we think we're doing, and how we maintain some kind of ability to do Luca-type work. I'm also very concerned about politics, actually, and what it is that's going on in political life and what the nature is of politics that makes this type of thing apparently so attractive to policymakers, because that speaks to me of something very problematic happening at the level of politics and what we think politics is there to do and what it should be like.
Okay, well, thank you, Ellie, and thank you to our panel. focus this up here before I come out to you, I want to try and look at really what's new in this discussion, because presumably academics have always wanted to influence, even if it's not just directly social policy. We don't want to just write books and have nobody read them and have no impact. And presumably the political sphere has always wanted to have some sort of basis on which to maybe inform some of their decisions and maybe gain some sort of authority. So the question I'm interested in is what's new, and I think perhaps one way to try and tackle that is around this, this idea of evidence. I mean, each of the panellists talked about evidence, and they talked about evidence in quite different ways, but it's certainly a word you see a lot in the political discourse. And it struck me that maybe you were talking about slightly different things. Val said something along the lines of the use of evidence supplants political discussion, which I think maybe we should unpick. And Jude, and I think somebody else, talked about the way in which evidence wasn't being used properly, or the wrong evidence was being used. So can we try and unpick that in our comments as we respond on the panel to each other, in terms of what's new and what is evidence and how should it be used politically. Peter, can I pick on you first?
Not sure I want to be defending social scientists against Ian Duncan Smith, because I think there's a great risk in accepting the justifications that are used for particular policy initiatives, which I think are designed with no reference at all to any serious social science evidence. And I think that's always been the case. If you look at the debates about the Gillies Acts in 1922, there were references to the economics of L.C. Knight, there were even references back to Adam Smith. There was social science was deployed, and a particular theory about how markets worked, to justify policies. But I don't think it caused those policies. I think there are other political and ideological issues. There are also, dare I say, issues of the interests of the particular classes that were in power at the time that were relevant. And I think exactly the same applies to debates now. We may refer to the term evidence, but it's not evidence that drives policy. And I would be amazed to see any case of policy which you can demonstrate is driven by evidence and not by interests and not by political ideologies.
Val, what do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that the whole question around evidence is really important, because I think there needs to be a much more sort of critical engagement with what is meant by evidence. You know, whose evidence is it, and what makes it evidence? Because evidence it's not just out there to be discovered. It's actively produced through a process of thinking and arguing and interpreting. And I think as well, sometimes social scientists would disagree fundamentally with the way that their work is being used and cited as evidence. So actually I think we need to get away from the idea of evidence as being about incontrovertible facts, and more towards seeing it as a very important tool, but a tool in opening up debates and policy debates.
I don't know if I managed to do this, because I think there are two things going on really. I think Peter's just identified one of the problems. And I think being a sociologist, and having been a sociologist for quite a long time, actually you're regarded as a bit suspect. And I think one of the issues was that you were always a bit left-wing if you were a social scientist. And that's always been an underlying issue. And what Peter said about the interests of the state and so on actually brings that into kind of stark relief. And if you look at something like the origins of the welfare state, I mean, there's a very good thing though. Evidence was used. One of the things that drove the development of the welfare state, certainly at the beginning of the 20th century and the beginning of after the Second World War, was about the conditions of recruits that were being recruited. The Boer War recruits were found to be severely undernourished, and that started to drive a certain amount of change. Similarly, after the First World War. Now, Marxist analysis of this, and this is a long time since I've done this, so I might get this wrong, that's why I'm a bit dubious about it, but actually says it's in the state's interests to actually look after its population. So at that point, so the Marxist analysis of the welfare state origin says that's actually because the state realised it had to do it. Whereas we have also a very much more ideologically driven, altruistic thing coming out of the Labour Party. Well, it's a mixture of all those types of things, and that's one of the problems, that actually it's not simple, it doesn't have these simple answers. But I thought the other thing I'd say on a much, much lower scale, going back to what I said, or not lower scale, on a much more simple scale, was that, going back to what I said about evidence from 30 years ago, I have been absolutely horrified. Ian Duncan Smith's going to get a real hammering this morning, I think, but he recently was quoted, and I think it was him, as saying that people needed to get on the bus and go and look for work. Now, this is very similar to Tebbit saying, get on your bike and look for work in the early 80s. And at that point, I worked on a very small piece of work which looked at something called the Employment Transfer Scheme. I think I did 30 qualitative interviews with people who'd taken up the scheme to move for work. And I think they got some vast amount of money, like about £30, but, you know, we are talking about the 80s, so it was a lot of money in those days. But it was very difficult. There were lots of issues around this. This very small piece of work pulls out all the issues. And even just looking at something like that would improve policy making and assumptions. And it goes back to what Ellie was saying about all the work that's done on teenage mothers and, you know, early parenthood. And I recently read a report and I was thinking, I have a niece who was pregnant at 23. She's in the group that said, oh, it's early pregnancy. It's terrible. She did it on purpose. She made a conscious decision. That doesn't seem to be taken into account when we're talking about these things. So sorry, that's a mixture of, sorry, there's probably lots of different things all mixed up in there. But I think it's complicated, this issue of evidence.
Ellie, what are your thoughts? Well, I'm interested in what other people have got to say about one particular issue, which is how you understand what it is that's going on in politics, really. And while it's I agree with Peter that if you look back at politics, you can find, you know, there's nothing new on the face of planet Earth, so you can find examples going back a very long time of politicians, you know, referring to the evidence says and what have you. I mean, one thing I do think that's new about now is that when it comes to policy, it's pretty much the only game in town, or maybe at least the policy documents I read. I mean, they're just fuller and more full of the evidence says, the evidence says, the evidence shows. I mean, it's pretty much the vocabulary of the thing now. Certainly in an area like parenting, politics and family. And I do find it quite intriguing because I'm not sure I'd go with the idea that we can explain this on the grounds of ideology. I almost think it's perhaps the opposite is more true. I suppose when I think about what's happening at the moment is that politics is facing a problem of legitimacy. Political parties seem to be a bit at sea in terms of what to do, how you understand things. Political parties seem to have experienced a sense where they're backtracking all the time on old solutions which used to be their traditional ones, if you think about Conservative Party solutions or Labour Party solutions to problems. And it's more like you've got this sort of taking on the garb of evidence and taking on the garb of social science in a context where politics has become contentless and politics has become vacuous and politicians really don't have a sense of what politics is. And so you have this sort of idea about evidence coming to the fore in that type of context. So it is taking on a clothes because they don't have clothes of their own. I mean, is the emperor's no clothes, new clothes. It's covering yourself in something because you don't really know what it is that you're trying to say about who you are and what you should be doing and where society should be going. And I think it's kind of becoming more and more of the nature of politics in that kind of context.
I think we need to go to meetings. Oh, I can see a few hands. Who wants to speak? Let's have microphone people. Microphone person? Oh, they're getting their stuff together. Well, I'm going to cherry pick. I'm going to start with that chap there. Can you go to there? And if you give this lady there, we'll take a few and come back and take a few. So you start and then you.
Thanks. My name's Sandy Starr. I'm interested in objectivity and impartiality, real and imagined, and where those qualities should be championed and where they shouldn't be championed. And Val, I thought you gave a very good account of how politicians might ape the social sciences because the apparent objectivity that gives what they do. I'd be interested to know if you or the other panellists think there's also a problem of social scientists aping the apparent objectivity of natural scientists to legitimise what they do. And the reason I ask that, I work in the field of genetics and assisted conception. I think social scientists have a very valuable contribution to make in that area in terms of capturing social dynamics that aren't rigidly circumscribed by the natural world. But it seems to me that often, with some honourable exceptions, they're so busy emulating the categories of the natural sciences that they fail to make that contribution.
Just a couple of things. On evidence, when you just came back on the question of evidence, I think especially maybe in the way that Val came back on it, almost sounded as if you were saying evidence is not really evidence, that it's kind of politically biased in the first place, and to me, I just wondered if you could say a bit more about that and what that means. What is evidence really, as opposed to the way it's used and picked up? And then secondly, on what Ellie was saying about politicians, the use of evidence, and it almost seemed, I was just thinking, in the past I think politicians maybe said constituents say this, my constituents think this, or the people that I'm representing think this, and that's why we should do something. And it's almost now the people, us, are out of the equation, and it's like the evidence has been, substitute for the people.
Okay, keep your hands up so I can see, because I know a lot of people want to speak. We'll go there, I'll take two more, and I'll come back with one word lines.
I suppose I'm just wondering if as social scientists, although actually as a political theorist, obviously I have no scientific credentials whatsoever, but nonetheless I'm wondering if as social scientists we should perhaps be less concerned about evidence, by which I don't mean disregard evidence, but actually it doesn't seem to me that social science is all about evidence. It's actually about the generation and production of knowledge about society, which needs evidence, requires evidence, but also requires evidence to be interpreted and made sense of in the context of lots of certainly non-empirical bits of information and structures of understanding. And in that sense, actually, that's what social science at its best does. It's not something which starts and stops at the question of what evidence is available. I also think, and this is something that, the panel's discussion so far has been fascinating, and this is already alluded to, but it's also on that level that that generation of knowledge has profound implications and very positive implications for politics. And what's interesting about politics at the moment is precisely that in limiting itself to that question of evidence, even good evidence, even evidence which is not cherry-picked, it limits itself entirely to what is. This is what we know the evidence tells us, this is all we can do therefore, this is what we've got to deal with. And actually the role of social science in a more productive and beneficial way to the question of politics allows us to raise the questions of what could be. How can we actually develop our political understanding? How, in other words, can we take politics forward, as a couple of panelists have suggested, think in different categories, raise different kinds of questions about what the world could be like. So in that sense, maybe we should, be more critical of the idea that actually all of you guys are just about the production of evidence in the first place.
The point of the social sciences today, in the way that they are deployed, I very much agree with the point made over there, is to counteract the weightlessness of the political elite, to give them some backup, precisely because there isn't the constituents or the labour movement, there isn't a social force out there that they can call on, because they don't really represent anything very much. And in that respect, I suggest the deployment of the social sciences is currently intended to give some sense of authority and to compensate for that weightlessness. And I would question actually whether it's only the outlaws, the renegades, the third-rate sociologists who are willing to go along with this. I have in mind the scurrilous ESRC pamphlet that I picked up recently saying, what was it titled? The Contribution of Sociology to Wellbeing. You can't get more cultish than that. And I agree that there is a political debate to be had here. Thankfully, that's what we're here to do. But I think there is a tendency to try and displace this debate out there, to invite other experts and the public. The public's not there. The political elite know that the public's not. That's why they need evidence to give them some backup. I really think that social scientists have got to get their house in order, and that actually to have a hypothesis of what social science is for, and to give some evidence for it, and to debate that, whether or not it's behind closed doors, quite honestly, I don't mind. But I think setting your own house in order is the thing to be getting on with.
I'm going to take the man behind you with glasses, and then going to come to the panel for one line. I know there are lots of people who want to speak, so I will get you in.
It's fascinating for me as a physicist to listen to the debates about impact from the social scientists. In particular, this idea that by chasing after impact, you actually lessen the impact of your work. that's a problem that I see increasingly with the Research Council's drive towards impact. Certainly, from my perspective as a physicist, what's happening is that we are being driven effectively towards more neo-market, more applicable, more market-driven work. And the question is, we can debate this to the end of the day. It seems that there's a huge consensus. Something like 18,000 people signed up to a UCU petition against the inclusion of impact in area. What, as academics, do we do about it? I have certainly some ideas, but I'd like to hear comments from the panel.
Okay, well, the panel to come up for one line. Do you want to speak as well, Mr.? Do you want to speak as well? Is that
Yeah, well, just one question.
Okay, go right ahead, then the panel for one line. Go on.
Okay, so I think that social science should be politicized, but the other way around as they are today. And my example would be Italy in the 70s, where the social unrest was born in the departments of sociology, for example, in Padova. So my question would be, does the radical sociology has any future? And if yes, how could it materialize in a way not similar with the 70s or the 60s, of course, but in a similar way in modern era?
Okay. Who would like to take all that up in one line? Peter, you start.
My one-liner would be fairly long line, but it would say, I still think we're framing the debate wrong. We're focusing too much on social science, and we're talking about quite a narrow area, and probably the least influential area of social science, sociology, social policy area. We're saying very little indeed about the most important area, which is the particular applied bits of economics allied with some areas in psychology. And we're overemphasizing the weight that we have in policy making. I think social science is relatively unimportant in policy making. Its interests primarily, not ideology, but influencing ideological expressions that are the most important thing. So, very long line.
That's fine. Ellie?
I'm become completely allergic to the word evidence and have committed myself to never using it again of anything I ever write. So I see myself as doing something entirely different to producing evidence, which I wouldn't have said before now particularly. The reason for that is that evidence, if you read the policy documents, is pretty much a straightforward, causal, determining process where what policymakers are interested in is how you relate something that you might do to changing the way somebody behaves. And that's what they're interested in. And that's really what evidence-based policy is, which I think is part of the reason why behavioural psychology is at the fore in certain types of economics, is that what policy is interested in doing is influencing individual behaviour. And what's called evidence is a type of social science which says, well, this is how you do that. As far as I'm concerned, that's got nothing to do with anything that I have ever been involved in, and also goes entirely, completely taking on board your points, Andy, about the history of social science and the emergence of sociology as a counterweight to the influence of Marxism in its modern form, which I completely agree with. I think that's true as a historical account of things. That version of what social science is about, to me, is entirely at odds with what you learn in Sociology 101, which is there's no single explanation for anything, nothing has a single cause. Yet that is the type of thinking which is very, very dominant now. So, I mean, in terms of getting our own house in order, I certainly think one thing to do is to kind of create a revolt against evidence and try and make the case for scholarship, knowledge, research, I mean anything else. It's not a semantic discussion, but make the case for another type of way of generating understanding. That was a very long line, sorry.
Val, long one line.
Well, no, I really agree with Ellie on that, but I think sort of on a broader level, there's a problem in that there seems to be an assumption that good social science should bring clarity to issues around social policy. And, you know, sometimes it does. But very often it does the exact opposite, because it just reveals the deep complexity of the issues that are at stake and the interrelated nature of all the different social problems and like Ellie said, the multiple causalities that there are at work. So I think that that's why good social science doesn't lend itself that easily to the kind of quick fix policy solutions that politicians often crave. But I think, as Ellie says, we should be sort of trying to argue that that's a strength and not a weakness.
Jude.
I suppose I wanted to go back. One of the things I'd like to pick up on is the issue about impact. I do happen to be involved in the ESRC, particularly the Impact Network. I think my view is we read 3 paragraphs rather than 1 line, but I think we should be careful about not throwing impact out in the sense that the baby in the bathwater, because what we need to do is expand our understanding of it. And I think that even the ESRC and the other research councils are beginning now to recognise that you can't just say that this has to be cause and effect, and that actually all of the work that's done about impact has to be around, has to be instrumental, that there are conceptual issues and that there are issues about framing and understanding. And I think that actually what's happened with the push back that there's been on impact is that there's a recognition growing, because I'm sure physics wouldn't actually agree that everything they do has an immediate impact. A lot of things, I'm sure that Hadron Collider thing involves is all driven by curiosity. Amazing way of getting loads of funding. But actually what they did was they said, we are curious about this, and I think we need to be confident to say, we want to look at this because we're curious about what it means. It won't necessarily have an immediate impact. And I think we need to push that debate, because going back on the social policy thing, something like Sure Start, the big problem with that, sort of trying to evaluate that, is it was expected to have an impact in a year. It's probably going to take 20 years for that type of activity. So it's actually really pushing the boundaries of that debate on impact for me.
You can come back. I've been ignoring these people. I'll ignore you next. Yes, you.
I just wanted to pick up, there seems to be a bit of theme on the absence of the public, and I think Peter raised the first discussion, how do public debates happen? And people seem to be saying, well, what happens is that with the absence of the public social science or neuroscience, for example, in science, is a thing that gives politicians some ballast. But my question is, isn't it also about a fear of the public, or they do have to persuade the public, or are we saying the public is entirely absent from any necessity in policy decisions? So my thing would be perhaps it's to close off public debate, certainly particularly within early intervention literature, when they talk about neuroscience. That's like neuroscience, well, how can anyone talk about that or dissect that? And presumably there must be, or is there not, some way they want to persuade the public. If you are taking the logical conclusion on early intervention and the harsh policies they are going to do, which are ideological, presumably you are trying to persuade a section of the population to accept that sort of harsh intervention within people's lives.
Okay, and there's you. If you go back to that man there, I'll take you next.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to Andrew's question, because I don't think the panel's directly addressed it yet. Because just to make a rude sociological observation about the panellists is that you all sound a bit moany. And I just wonder whether there's a victim culture within social sciences, because nobody's forced to publish rubbish. And I think that's where Andrew was going with his question. And so if they are, why is that?
Okay, there's a woman next to you.
Hi, I'm Westenberg, ESRC. Probably shouldn't admit that in this audience, considering some of the comments recently. I would like to just make one comment on what Val said earlier on. We do not fund research based on impact. We fund research based on excellence, and there's no change in our policy whatsoever in that area. And I'm perfectly happy with anyone. Flip and I have had several exchanges on this already, and we'll have another debate this afternoon. I'm perfectly happy with anyone to talk about that. The more serious point, I think, what I want to come back to is actually the point about evidence and effect on policy. And I want to pick up on the point that Peter made about that actually the effect social science have is very, very small. Now, in a personal level, I did some research several years ago in a government department, and the two lessons I learned from that was that one, social science research doesn't make it onto the actual agendas of the people who develop policies. It's a tiny, tiny part, and most of it is the simple statistic stuff. There isn't pick-up of any of the ideas, the knowledge, the debates, any of that. The second thing is that most of the documents that, for example, Ellie quoted, are written by government officials, most of whom actually have a social science degree. Quite a lot of them have one. And actually the role of the politicians in the end is often very, very small. So I think if we want to make sure that there is more of a debate and that social sciences with its full breadth contributes, it's not just about pushing data forward, it's about pushing the right things forward and thinking about engaging at a political level, but also with those people in government departments who actually do a lot of the hard work.
Jane Holmes's book, published in 2004 on the history of sociology in Britain, includes the results of a survey that he did of sociology professors. I think there are about 200 sociology professors answered, which included questions on their politics. And 90% of them described themselves as far left or moderate left. Most of the rest of them said that they were somewhere in the centre. The second question was, how would you vote? And 5 out of more than 200, and I confess here I was one of them, said that they would vote Conservative. Now my question to your panel, and again I've come to a conference called Battle of Ideas, I'm struggling to hear a battle of ideas from the panel. As usual when I come to a sociology conference, I can't get a fact paper between any of the speakers in terms of their basic ideological position. My question is, why on earth would you expect this subject to be taken seriously by policymakers when it is so unmitigatingly, unremittingly and unapologetically biased towards one political position?
You might have a disagreement there. Let's start at the back with that gentleman there. And then, do you mind as well? Yeah.
Well, I'm partly provoked by the last point there, because I think there's 2 ways in which ideology is being used in the discussion here. There's ideology in the sense of political ideologies like conservatism, liberalism, socialism. And ideology in that sense, I think, is dead. The difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party is marketing or branding, it's not ideology. And what we're left with then is ideology in the sense that Marx talks about it in the German ideology as a mystification of the world, or the world as it seems to appear on the surface. And that's why it's behaviouralism and different forms of economics that have the ear of government today, because it's on that basis of understanding of ideology. And I think that the question for the social sciences is, how do you challenge that, challenge ideology in that sense today, when there isn't a counterweight, or where's the audience for developing those ideas that challenge ideology in that sense?
There's a hand flying around there. We crossed the hand.
Yeah, I direct a civil liberties campaigning group, and I would have thought the naive answer to the question, what's the point of social policy, is to improve people's lives. And I think what's become interesting is that instrumentalism is seen purely in terms of the state, almost an end in itself, to affect policy, and almost to take a strategic alliance with the state, and in some ways against the public. I think that it's a particular problem now because the nature of policy, which we've discovered in a lot of our campaigns, particularly on alcohol, is just bizarre. It's developed in this strange world that bears no relationship to reality. For example, there's a policy consensus that women should not drink more than 2 units of alcohol a night or they're going to have severe health problems. Now, this does not bear any relationship to people's everyday lives or what, the way that people actually drink. I mean, I don't drink at all, and I drink more than that. Another consensus is that people shouldn't touch a job before they're 18. And I've actually kind of said to these people, when did you have your first drink? And they were like, the point is you went to a pub when you were 16, like everyone else. And so the point is that policy has developed these consensus on areas, and the job of social science is to transmit that to the public and to act upon the public with those consensus. And I think that in many ways, for me, the radical job of social science now would be to reconnect policy with the reality of life, the reality of what people value, and to make people's lives freer and better, and actually to take on those issues and change it. One of our key campaigns has been against the vetting database. And we tried talking to policymakers, had lots of fruitless cups of tea in the Houses of Parliament, and then we thought, sod this, and we just started to talk to the public. And we got things in the media, and that, at the end of the day, they reviewed the policy and going to change the law. So I think that talking through to politicians through the public, in some ways, is another role for social science, another way of affecting policy, rather than taking a direct strategic alignment with the state and essentially reinforcing their prejudices against citizenry.
Okay. Gentleman there, the man with the mic start, and then we'll go to you, and then we'll go to you, and then that's it.
Okay, I went to a similar debate like this a few weeks ago at the British Academy, where David Willits was there, and it was essentially the social sciences and the humanities essentially pleading for their relevance. And what I'm curious about the panel, because it seems to be a kind of the panel saying, well, we're kind of shut out in the cold. It's not us, but at the actual discussion, the British Academy, and I think some of the ESRC were there, were really trying to say they were at the forefront of policy, and they're really talking about the behaviour change and kind of that we can devise surveys to make people change their behaviour, etc. So there's one thing. So is it like you guys are shutting out in the cold, and it's like a public face of social science that's there trying to push this stuff? And the second point is, what is the role of interdisciplinary studies in this? Because you mentioned the point about it's mostly neuroscience and psychology, and maybe that's where IDS has got some of his stuff from. He's assuming it's social science, it might be from a completely different discipline. But it does seem to be the case. I'm just wondering, in the case of that, is it the case that policymakers are trying to bring different strands of different disciplines together and making a hash of it? Is it possible to use interdisciplinary studies in that way? Because, you know, one could say maybe we could understand that with the world, or what do people think about it? Is that legitimate or not?
Okay, I'll take you, then the panel have the final remarks, and that's it. So.
Yeah, I thought on the conservatism point that it was much more the case that it was conservatives who were hostile to social science. I mean, not hostile, that's too strong. But, you know, a bit standoffish, and it's a shame really, because a lot of the great insights of conservatism would be a fantastic contribution, I think, to make us a bit more cautious about what social science can and can't achieve. I think some greater sense of the law of unintended consequences would have been very good in understanding why social policy doesn't always work out how we understand it. I think some greater understanding of the way that we can deceive ourselves about the capacity for reason to resolve all questions would have been a great contribution. But overall, one of the great insights of conservatism is that for most of the time, nothing really changes quite as much as you think it's going to, which obviously can deceive you, because sometimes it does. But for most of the time, most of the people who say to you things are about to change dramatically tend to be wrong.
Yeah. Okay, there's a lady there. If you take it then as well, then I'll get you and then we'll come.
Okay, I'd just like to draw attention really to the proliferation of evidence gathering that goes on. I think it's an area, and Ellie kind of made me think about this when you referred to that policy document. And the way that policy is formed now, and the way that all of us working in any area of public life, public institutions, I'm in the arts, spend a great deal of our time collecting data, collecting evidence, and feeding it into some policy-making machine somewhere. And I think it's this kind of constant evidence gathering. And so I would challenge your point that evidence, that ideological thinking drives political decision-making.
Interest, not ideology.
Interest. I think that actually what's happened, we've kind of all opted out of political thinking. I find that evidence gathering actually replaces thinking often, and that a lot of public institutions are actually run on the basis of what last year's or what the mid-term statistics tell you. And I think that's a very, very dangerous. In other words, this is proliferating throughout society. It isn't just a problem for social sciences.
On the basis of questioning everything, I'm wondering now whether social sciences should just have nothing to do with policy at all. I can't. There's all through this we've been assuming that there's a connection, and I'm not at all sure that there is a necessary or should be a necessary connection. And I've used that word should, and I'd like to thank Ellie for using the word true, which is the first time I've heard the word true in this discussion, and James at the back for talking about knowledge, because I think knowledge and truth are two fundamental values that evidence and social sciences today are not reinforcing, but they're actually bypassing. They're a way of preventing people from thinking, not just thinking, but making a moral or a value judgment and standing by it.
Well, thank you. I think Peter has referred a few times to the fact that evidence plays very little role in policy making, which I think is a fair enough observation. What I don't go along with so much is the idea that what's really determining things is interests. I think that clearly interests do still play a certain role. They played a much larger role in the past, I would suggest, when we had politics. Today we have some people who call themselves politicians, but we don't actually have politicians or politics anymore. What we have is what has been widely referred to policy makers. This is a very different kind of process that's going on. And I think what that reflects is a process where you have a whole lot of undebated hidden assumptions, which leave very little role for the critical dimensions of social sciences. It seems to me that what policymakers are trying to do is really, as they see it, control the bestial side of humanity. I mean, I think that came out very clearly in the kind of Ian Duncan Smith document that Ellie referred to, this underclass kind of breeding away. And I would suggest that the kind of economic discussions about the city and finance are perhaps not so far away from that. And so what you land up with is a situation where evidence is mobilised to control within fixed limits. And I think that's the real problem. I don't have a problem with the idea of social science as something that allows us to understand the world and therefore change it. And evidence, I think, in that sense, used properly, can be a very powerful thing. I think the problem are the undebated assumption that the goal of action is always just to kind of contain the destructiveness of humanity. And I think that once we get beyond that to think about how we can use our understanding and knowledge of the world to kind of creatively change it, we can start to make some progress.
Okay, well, I'm going to let the panel have final words in the order they spoke. So that's Peter, Val, Jude and Ellie. So Peter, your final lines.
Well, couple of quick points. One is going back to the politics of sociology. I'm feeling sad because I feel I failed to communicate anything. But I do think we do need to bear in mind that, yet again, that sociologists are probably the weakest group in relation to policy making. They're even weaker than social policy experts. The strongest group, let's remember that again, are economists. And when you look at the political complexion of economists, you get a rather different profile. You get a very broad profile, but it's right across the political spectrum. So I think we do need to bear in mind which social sciences we are talking about. Social science is enormous, and we're only a very small part of it. Other point, can I just say again, it's interests that drive policy making. It's not ideas. Interests use, incredibly crudely, interests use ideas. They use the ideas we generate. They use information, and most of it, I suspect, is management information you're talking about, not empirical information about the external world in the process. But it's the interests that really matter, and that's where you have to look if you want to see what's happening and why particular ideas are taken up by Ian Duncan Smith or whoever at particular points in time.
Thanks, Peter. Val.
I'm going to know, I'm afraid. Because, I think that actually my personal ability to do social science is under threat, and funding is everything. So, you know, I think there is something to moan about, and I think what we might very well see is as a kind of amongst all these cuts and you know, focus on finances, is a withdrawal into kind of large-scale quantitative cohort studies that are already there. That, you know, because I think policymakers and politicians do tend to feel much more comfortable with numbers because that equates to facts, you know, in their head, even though numbers and facts have to be actively interpreted. So I think we will end up with a lot of data around maybe patterns of behaviour, but very little insights into the meanings and, you know, the real experiences behind them.
Jude.
I was going to say the opposite. I was going to say I'm really sorry if we've all been a bit moany, because actually one of the joys of the role that I'm in at the moment is that the amount of things I've been involved in, and there's absolute fantastic activities. So recently we had an event which looked at the geopolitics of the Arctic regions. We've had events on food, the sociolinguistics I talked to you about, the exhibition called Evolving Englishes. We've got a website which actually is all about looking at the Summer and Paralympics through the lens of social science. We're having an exhibition on the census next year. So the breadth and the depth of all of that type of activity is fantastic. And I just think as well, I'm going to stick mine up and defend a bit about the empirical and the evidence role in the policy cycle. What if we didn't have any evidence at all? Even, you know, so we can't argue against anything if there is no evidence. And I think that's something we need to remember, that without the evidence you can't make an argument again. Well, you can, but then what I would be saying is, well, who says? The public says. Well, who's the public? Who is this amorphous body out there? At least if you do a survey, at least you can say, well, it's a random sample of 1,500 people in X regions, etc. But I just think about what Ellie said as well. I put a little note that in about 1976, I think, I was involved when I worked at the Office of National Statistics in a very lowly fashion in a survey on family formation. And that survey was one of the first things that addressed this issue of why women got pregnant and how they got pregnant. And we asked the women in that question whether they got pregnant the last time they got pregnant on purpose, accidentally on purpose, or by accident. And we got glorious answers about, well, did accidentally on purpose include sticking pinholes in the Durex? So actually, you know, that's what social science can also do in a very small sort of microcosm way, or that type of research. But I think it's still about understanding context, complexity as well for me.
Thank you, Jude and Ellie.
Well, we probably do need to get a bit more backbone as sociologists, but I don't know anymore that that's any more true than other groups in the academy and other sectors of society. And I think it's an issue to think about where that backbone comes from. I mean, I know what it looks like when I see it. It's a harder thing to work out where you get there. To come back to Luca, that's what it looks like when I see it. What the backbone is prizing intellect, prizing intellectual life, and prizing the capacity of intellectual life in whatever form it takes, whether it's sociology, whether it's physics, whether it's history, whatever discipline it is, wherever it comes from, prizing the capacity of intellectual life to enlighten and to increase understanding of the past, the present and the future. And that's the thing that I'm interested in doing. In terms of doing that and what that's all about, I do think that actually the policy process and policymakers, to come to your point, is part of the picture, but no more part of the picture than anything else. And I do think that a lot of the reason why things are getting a bit difficult at the moment is because that's been given a special priority for no obvious reason. I mean, as far as my own work goes, I'm perfectly happy if it influences policymakers and if it gets them to think again and broaden their perspective on things. But that's not what I'm setting out to try and do in the first place. There's loads and loads of reasons to try and enlighten, and there's no reason for singling out that particular group in society for special attention. And I think that getting to a point where, as a culture, generally speaking, we just become less Philistine and more interested in intellectual life is probably at the, you know, the heart of the whole problem. But I certainly don't think that's something that sociologists can do on our own, even if we do stop moaning.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's the start of the discussion.